Good evening and welcome. It's a real dream come true for me to be in the midst of this very special week at the Philharmonic. It happens to be my final week as music director of the York Philharmonic, and as one does when one comes to this kind of moment, it's possible to think about how you want to go out. My tendency is to want to go out not with a bang but with a whimper, but largely because of a very meaningful conversation I had with Yo-Yo a couple of years ago. I've been thinking about how music and culture and musicians can hopefully in a very real way do things that help make the world a better place. And there have been very exciting discussions happening recently with the United Nations. I would love to be able to create an orchestra to help the UN, to bring people together. And the idea that I have is to invite musicians from around the world to get together and to play concerts in very specific locations on very specific occasions where the United Nations and we think mutually that something beneficial can happen by giving this message of cooperation and shared humanity. This week at the New York Philharmonic is not a launch of that orchestra per se, but it is I think very much a launch of that idea. We've invited musicians from over 20 countries. I think we have, how many musicians, Louise? 22 or 23? Yeah, from around the world who have joined the New York Philharmonic for these final concerts that I do as music director. I wanted to create a week that was rich with different elements. There's a little exhibition that examines what orchestras have done, including the New York Philharmonic, in the area of cultural diplomacy. And we also planned this event, this symposium, to kick this question around. What is cultural diplomacy? Can it work? Does it work? What is its place in the world that we live in today? I'm thrilled that Fareed Zakaria has agreed to moderate, and we have a very distinguished panel to talk about this question. Deborah Spahr is the president of Lincoln Center. Karim Wasfi is a wonderful cellist and conductor, music director of the Iraqi National Symphony. Irina Bokova is the director general of Unesco, and Yo-Yo Ma is Yo-Yo Ma. There's a lot to talk about, and there are quite a number of us on the panel. I don't want to take any more time, but I just thought I'd give a little bit of a background behind what's going on here. So maybe I'll pass it over to you.
Alan, thank you so much. This is such an honor for me to be on this panel because obviously I am relatively uncultured compared to the other people on this panel. And I'm not quite sure why Alan, actually Louise Shackleton, my dear friend and neighbor, asked me to do this. But I thought I'd just start by saying a few words about something that feels like it is an idea under siege these days, and to link it to this evening and these projects. And that is the idea of globalism, which is, of course, now spoken of in very derogatory terms, or the global community, which our president has assured us does not exist. And what I want to talk about is the degree to which something like this panel represents a reality that we shouldn't forget about. You know, we all live in countries, we all live in cities, we all live in communities, and we are tied to them, passionate about them, love them dearly. But one of the great enterprises for human beings for the last few thousand years, and particularly since the Enlightenment, has been this idea of trying to find things that are universal about us as human beings and finding them through some sense of connection with other communities, other cities, other countries. We all understand it with science. You know, one of the things people will often talk about is that science has no boundaries, and that the progress of science continues, whether it's happening in China, whether it's happening in Japan, whether it's happening the United States. But actually, the same is true for art and culture, because they similarly reflect the aspirations of human beings to do their best, to find some kind of truth that is universal. And if you think about this panel, you have this extraordinary array of talent, myself accepted, as I pointed out, but also think about the places that people come from, the kinds of things that they're trying to connect to. That's what a global community is. That's what globalism is. It's not some kind of phony idea. It's not, it's not something that says nations are not important or patriotism isn't important, but it is a desire to try to find some of those common elements that we celebrate, because we celebrate the human aspiration to find the universal, to find the eternal, to find the true. Now, having put it in those kind of glorified terms, I'm going to ask Deborah Spahr, who, in addition to being the president of Lincoln Center, is also a trained and highly accomplished political scientist who taught when we were in graduate school at Harvard together. What does it mean practically? Does it matter? Does it make a difference? Why should people care? Why should we, how do you respond to President Trump when he's probably going to say, why should the taxpayers of West Virginia have bear any burden for this?
Figuring out how to respond to President Trump is probably not the most useful way to spend one's time these days. But of course we have to. All of us who care about the arts, who care about diplomacy, who care about globalism, as you put it, we have to find ways of responding. And I think most of us on this group, and I suspect in this room, would suspect that tweeting may not be the best form of response, but instead we need to find other ways to keep on with the work that we consider to be so important. And since you brought it up, I think you and I are both personally bear witness to the various forms that diplomacy can take. So I began my personal career expecting to go into the Foreign Service. And long story short, was really talked out of it by Foreign Service officers who convinced me that diplomacy was no longer happening through the State Department in the ways it once did. So I went to Harvard to study political science and discovered that political science had taken a turn to the scientific side, and that those of us who really cared about diplomacy and politics had to go elsewhere. And without going into my full life's journey, I find myself now at Lincoln Center in odd ways saying, well, perhaps this is one of the best spots from which to engage in diplomacy, particularly at this moment, because one of the horrible things we're seeing in this world is that people of different ideologies and different philosophies aren't talking to each other anymore. We've lost the ability to engage through words. We are increasingly, in this technological world we live in, isolating ourselves in tiny little pods of people who think just like ourselves. And so what we need to do, those of us who care about breaking these silos down and care about the humanist endeavor, is we have to find different languages. And the language of arts, the language in particular of music, language of poetry, is a way to actually communicate that gets around the words and the ideologies that are really chaining us so deeply these days. So I think the arts has a huge role to play, and it has to play that role, and we need to be thinking more creatively about how we undertake this responsibility, because it's a big and sadly, in many ways, a growing responsibility.
Irina, you run UNESCO, which is in some ways the world's premier cultural organization. So tell us, from your unique vantage point, what are the politics of cultural diplomacy right now? What are the trends? What are the things people talk about, worry about? What are the backlashes? Take us inside. Imagine we were in the UNESCO board meeting. What are people fighting about?
I think this is first and foremost a conversation that is long overdue, because you will not be surprised that coming from UNESCO, we think culture in the broad sense of the word. I'm not just speaking about art for the elites. I'm speaking really about culture. I'm speaking about heritage. I'm speaking about intangible heritage and culture that is there. in every society, which makes us human at the end of the day, is hugely important, particularly now when we speak about a globalized world but very fragmented. And as if technology and globalization and trade and everything goes faster than us as human beings, and we now have to catch up. So if we speak about what is nowadays with us, we are just catching up with all this, putting forward issues like identities, linking it to culture, looking at how we respond to these forces that want to make us believe that we cannot live. We cannot live together, that does not exist some common values. I think this is hugely important. What is currently, and this, by the way, thinking, this logic is very much evolving. I think nowadays it is understood widely that culture and represents a very important, I would say, binding force for us living together and making us a single community. When we speak about destruction of heritage, and we should not go far, because every single day, if we open a newspaper or a media, we see the consequences of what happened in Iraq, what happened in Syria, and so many of these places, in Mali, which is a part of the response to peace and security nowadays. So nowadays culture is so much linked to the global political agenda that we just cannot dissociate it. 2 months ago, the Security Council adopted a historic resolution on the role of culture and heritage in the conflict. And I said historic because until now, it was not considered at all that it is linked to peace and security. And we were totally detached from the conversation. I remember 2.5 years ago, I went when Mosul was occupied and when Daesh and ISIL invaded and occupied part of Iraq. And I went to Baghdad, and I went to Erbil. I came back, I visited some of the camps. I gave the certificate of the inscription of the citadel of Erbil into the World Heritage List, and it was to give them reassurance. It was so important for the Iraqi people, for the Kurdish autonomy. And I came back and I wrote a letter to all the members of the Security Council. And I said, you have to do something. Something terrible is happening in this world. You have to take your responsibility. And I remember I received polite answers, 1-2 paragraphs, and some of the media, sorry to say it, but some of your colleagues were looking with condescending and saying, come on, Director General, what do you want to do? Security Council to look at culture and heritage? This is not serious. Now we have it. So I say there is an evolution into the thinking of why it matters. This is one side. The other side, of course, which I think is very important nowadays, is overall about this universal language. It is about building bridges. It is about creativity. It is about unleashing the potential of people to create, to imagine. And nothing can happen without arts and culture today. If you ask some of the big companies, software companies, most of their softwares have studied something linked with culture, with creativity. So that is why we want that culture is part of the development of any society. It is part of the cohesion of a society. It is part of the ethics of society. It is part of a healing of society if there is a problem. So it is not just for the elites. It is really something that should be a very democratic approach to what we want to see a true society nowadays.
So I sometimes think about the idea that we are living in this globalized, fast-moving world, and I wonder whether it is really as globalized as people make it out to be. Because I think back to when I was growing up, and I think back to the world that one reads about, and it certainly seemed as though, for example, an average educated American would have much more contact with European movies, European drama, European literature in the 1950s and 60s than today. That what we have now globalized is a kind of mass largely American pop culture that spreads around the world, so that you could be in an airport in Istanbul or Shanghai and you will still hear, the strains of Taylor Swift coming out of the loudspeaker. But in a strange sense, you have actually not really globalized, meaning created a genuine two-way street or some kind of merger. I mean, if you think about how famous a movie director like Francois Truffaut was, there's nobody in the world really today who is as famous in America as many European directors. Kurosawa, Truffaut, Godard, all those people. And I'm using film because it's the most popular. You could say, much more about Karajan's status in the 70s versus, people would struggle to name the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. Yo-Yo Ma, you have tried to really fight this in a way. You have tried to both bring different cultures to one another, meld them together with your Silk Route projects. And I'm wondering what your thoughts about this are, what you've learned from that process. Are we genuinely interested in, and I say we Americans in the music of China? Are they much more interested in the music of the West? How would you describe this attempted globalism?
I don't know. I'm honest. I mean,
what have you learned from that project?
I think I've learned, as many people always do when they really start learning. I've learned something. Can you hear me? I guess this isn't really on. I've learned what many people learn when you investigate something deeply, that how much you don't know. And basically, it's a never-ending quest to learn more. But there are some things that we have learned that I think are kind of touch points in our work. So we read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Everybody knows about Romeo and Juliet. But we've also learned that actually in the Arab and Persian world, there's a similar love story, Layla and Majnun. And you mention Layla and Majnun, or Layli and Majnun in certain areas. Oh, you're being a little Majnun, you're a little crazy. And just knowing about that story and saying that to somebody from that world, it's like, oh, you know about something about me. It makes whatever follows, a transaction, a deal, whatever, so much easier, or working on a piece of music. And likewise, or the stories of just things that the way baseball can be a great way to start a conversation. But about Kalila Wadimna stories. You've heard them, right? Immediately there's a reference point. And I think the more reference points we have for each other's childhood stories, fairy tales, myths, certain habits that are quirky, that's something I think that really works. A piece of music. We had for a while a fabulous Azeri singer, but we also play Armenian music, and we also play with Armenian musicians. It gives great joy to actually have on the same stage people that actually like one another, that are from two countries that are not agreeing very much politically, right? I mean, it's like, because not everything in the world is defined by any one thing. Because if you try and define everything politically, there's so much more than that. Likewise economically, and likewise with culture. But if you actually put all the three together as three strong voices that have to interact and share the different types of thinking, you will, I think, end up with a society that is more thriving. Because there's that much more to talk about. There's that much more to care about. So that's...
I think that the point you make about also understanding, truly understanding other cultures and trying to get at it through these cultural reference points, their fairy tales, their stories, is so true. Because again, because you have this veneer of globalized culture, I actually think in some ways harder to really get to know a country. Because you have this mask that everyone puts on. Everybody, understands the internet, and everybody knows the music, and everybody knows a few 20 big Hollywood movies. But actually, you have to penetrate all that and get to a real culture. There's a wonderful piece in the Financial Times the other day by one of their columnists saying, everybody says that they go to travel somewhere because they want to learn about the culture. Well, actually, go to Wikipedia. If you want to really learn about Machu Picchu, there's a lot of stuff on there, and there are very good photographs. Yeah. If you really want to learn about a place, go and actually live there. Get a job, talk to people, understand what motivates them, pay the taxes in that country. And it really, the price of entry, has become much larger because you have to go deep. You can't just, on the surface, everyone seems like they're all kind of living in that same airport. All right, let me ask Karim this question. So 2 years ago, I did a documentary on Iraq, on the Iraq War. And we opened it with this absolutely haunting scene. A bombing takes place in some crowded area in Iraq. Terrible tragedy. Dozens of people dead, hundreds wounded. And very quickly, a few people arrive on the scene and set up a makeshift little chamber orchestra. Sometimes 3 people, sometimes just one. Sometimes just one cellist. And he starts playing Western classical music while the building is burning, while the police are coming around. And the point was, I think, an assertion of the best of life rather than the worst of life. And I say I think because, of course, that cellist was the conductor of the Iraq National Symphony and is Karim Wasfi. And so I want to ask you, why did you do that?
We had to overcome the obstacles of instability and transcend beyond the grotesque impact of killings and terror and intimidation and all that. As a conductor, I did partially this when I took over in 2006, 2007, the peak of instability and almost ethnic cleansing in Baghdad, as too many people know. But by then, I think what was targeted was life itself. The elements of life and the lifestyle and the choice for people to be able to make. I thought, and I believed, and I still do believe, that being proactive to de-radicalize, to prevent tension, to prevent terror, even at the grassroots level, we need to act proactively, even to the extent of turning every part of everyday life into a field of beauty, refinement, and cultivation, integration, mutual understanding, and a higher level of awareness, consciousness, and knowledge. Music does that. It transcends beyond the barriers of different cultures, even politically. So I did it as a proactive act of trying to, not even to counterbalance, to preserve the momentum of refinement and civility, and also to prioritize that, but also to overcome the impact of intimidation, and fear. Terrorists are targeting, to some extent, I think, the very soul, the concept of self-confidence and respect for life. I didn't mean to politicize music, but it was a message of refinement and civility to overcome the impact of the grotesque impact of killing and terror and intimidation. We have an obligation as artists and as musicians and in times of peace, but we have another responsibility and obligations also in times of instability, and I think it is global. It is very haunting to know that one person with a hammer 2 days ago in the UK would scare 600 individuals who were there. So the point was that to proactively share beauty, refinement, and civility versus intimidation and fear. And people were very well receptive and embraced it. As I said, as a conductor, I've done, I was proudly, I started with 13 families attending in 2007 because of random killings around Baghdad due to lack of mutual understanding and agendas of different sorts that had led almost to ethnic cleansing and a civil war, into a full house of 1,400 people attending, and people traveling for 5 or 6 hours just to attend a concert in Baghdad, and then they would go back to Basra or to Kut or whatever. So it's again to emphasize the concept of proactive. It's very, very strange. It's almost an anomaly that in times of connectivity and interdependence that we're living now, there is still such a high level of lack of mutual understanding. I think cultural diplomacy, referring to that, which was partially why I also played, combining social media with an interest in connectivity through sound and connecting sound to neuroscience, to cognitive psychology, to creation, to everything about creation and vibration. There is a way for people to connect. But the problem is, it's the governments, actually. I think people are connecting to some extent. The differences between the populace, between different communities and different cultures around the world are not at the level of the troublesome lack of mutual understanding or lack of harmonious relationships between governments, to the extent of, I think I wanted also to convey a message that we have to change the policies of governments that are leading to so much tension and so much instability. And to do that through music would be a message that can be conveyed and understood. And you nailed it. You nailed it as usual. You said it exactly the right way. Someone who knows, coming from you, saying that Laila Majnoon or Kalila Wadimna. Sorry. This is an impact. Someone in Amman or in Gaza or in Tel Aviv or in Baghdad or in Basra, you've had an access that is way, way, way more influential than tons of Tomahawk cruise missiles and weapons and all that.
I met him in 2004, right? When you were in the Iraqi National...
When we got the symphony to Washington.
To Washington. And it's so wonderful to see what you've done since that time. And to your point of being proactive, I'd just like to say that so much of what we're talking about, it sounds kind of highfalutin, sounds, this is like other people do this kind of cultural diplomacy. But I just want to point out that it takes a lot of courage and perseverance for Karim to have done what he's done.
Thank you.
And it's just extraordinary. And it takes a lot of courage for Alan, at the end of your tenure with the New York Phil, you choose to do something incredibly difficult. Bringing 23 people from 23 countries is not easy, But for you to do that, and maybe you're doing it because it's difficult, but I know it takes so much more energy, but I don't know whether it's because you speak 7 languages or because of whatever, but you're doing it for a particular reason other than this is something to do. So I just want to know, what is it? Well,
it's really inspiring to hear you all talk, because is my microphone working? Yeah. I think I'm not unique. I think a lot of my colleagues, a lot of musicians ask themselves, what can we do? What difference can it make? To hear what you started out doing and how it's progressed, and the fact that building these bridges actually can happen if one has perseverance and patience, that's inspiring to me. But it sometimes feels a little bit like a forlorn hope, because bombings still happen. And the New York Philharmonic did a wonderful concert in Pyongyang a number of years ago. I happened to just be changing planes, and I was in the lounge in the Frankfurt airport, and I just live, I thought I wasn't going to be able to see it, but I saw the New York Philharmonic, conducted by Lauren Mazel, playing a concert in Pyongyang, and they were playing Gershwin, an American in Paris. And I immediately got tears in my eyes. So I saw my mom there, and I saw all my friends. This was before I was music director, of course. And it seemed like an incredible way to bring people together. Music can serve as this gateway, and it's also about education. It's about teaching people that there is a shared culture, whether it's cultural background in terms of stories or legend or whatever. Apparently at that concert, let me just say, it was apparently the audience, you can feel when you're making a connection with the audience. Any performer would, I think, agree. And apparently early in the concert, it was pretty frosty, and the audience didn't quite know how to behave, whether they should show appreciation, what the appropriate time to applaud was. But by the end of the concert, this is anecdotal, but many people have reported about this. They said that there were smiles, and when the orchestra played Arirang, the national song of both Koreas, people were crying in the audience, and it completely broke down some sort of discomfort and sense of separation, and the audience wouldn't let the orchestra go. But to be cynical, look what's happening now in North Korea. Is it? And it's an honest question. I mean, is it worth it to do this kind of thing? Does it make a difference? Does it matter that the orchestra did it? I mean, I throw the question out to all of you.
It's not like there's so many other things that are working miraculously well.
Yeah, no.
So no, I mean that without being too cynical. It's I think in some ways, without being too pessimistic, you seize those moments of unity, of joy, of solidarity, even when perhaps particularly because they're not going to last. But if you can get those few magic moments, I think that's as good as anything else we're seeing in the world.
I do agree with you, and implicitly, I think the fact that we're all here, a priori, we believe that there is power and there's utility, and it's worth making these efforts. But it can feel like a drop in the bucket. But the idea of responding and showing the positive side of humanity, and at times it does feel as if it's scarcely there these days, but the idea that people can connect, it's a cliche, of course, but it couldn't be more true. Music does speak to people without language, and it's possible for anybody to understand what somebody else is feeling through music. And if you sing to somebody, there's an automatic connection. So that's my hope, anyway, that we can continue to build these bridges and show people implicitly that we do share something and that we can share a response.
But if you allow me, I think it's not a drop just in the sea, because you don't do that for a leader or for the leaders, you do it for the people, and it stays. One of the most fascinating projects that has happened during my tenure as Director General of UNESCO is to declare the International Jazz Day, talking about music, but Jazz Day. We started this in 2011, and with Thelonious Monk Institute, Herbie Hancock, and all the group of jazzmen, and we have gone to Istanbul to celebrate it, to Osaka, Paris, of course. We went to the hall of the United Nations General Assembly, and this year, last month, we celebrated this in Havana, in Cuba. And you cannot imagine what an enthusiastic public was there in Cuba. And it is not just one-day celebration, it is a whole week of training, of going to schools, of engaging, of joint jam sessions. Cuba was living, Havana was living with the American musicians. And it was fantastic to see the Cuban young musicians staying until early morning, playing with Marcus Miller or with Herbie Hancock or some of the others. And this is a true cultural diplomacy, because it will stay with these young people for a very long time. You don't do that for a president, for this leader, for another leader. You do it for the people. And I think this is how you connect people, this is how you transform societies, this is how you open societies. And as I said, it stays. It is worth doing it.
I love what you just said. That's such a great example. It seems to me, we've talked a little bit about individual action, right? And I hope this can actually result in everybody in this room, if you care about the subject, to take individual action and to think about. I had a conversation earlier with some people who are working in the administration of the Philharmonic saying, this is a great thing you're doing. However, we don't know what to do. So it's not about necessarily Alan leading the way saying, we're going to do this now, but it's really, that's one example of what can be done. But what can you do to break a barrier? You know, because it's the one-on-one contact between the young Cuban musician who's affected by Herbie Hancock that's going to change his life. Last night at the Lincoln Center, whatever, Hall of Fame,
inaugural Hall of Fame gala.
Right. Every single person, inaugural Hall of Fame, every single person there somehow referred to something that happened that made them want to do something. So Leontine Price was quoted for saying that she saw Marian Anderson, and then Denise Graves saw Leontine Price, and then it just led them to do that. Wynton Marsalis with Louis Armstrong. It was like, he said, I cannot say enough about Louis Armstrong. Everything that people can say, that's true. It's much more than that. I mean, it's great to see that. And the thing that joins music, I think, and science, culture, is memory. So how deep is something that affects you for life, right? That's the same thing in education. If you ace all the exams and forget everything, that's not an education. And how many things have we forgotten from what we studied and did either well or not well in? But what you remember is the blocks of memory that becomes cultural memory. Those are the treasures that I think we want to constantly mine and edit and to rethink, because those are the things that then give us meaning in life. So, and that along with safety, along with the ability and obviously, many other things. But if you want to do meaning, it's the little things that you do. Someone that you invited for dinner that you never knew, and that changes your attitude about something. I don't know, does that make sense? Is that too kind of plebeian and like?
No, it's wonderful, and I think you're right to talk about the micro level at which these things often operate. As you say, one gesture, one human being. I want to ask about a macro issue, which is when you playing Western music in the Middle East, did you get pushback? Did you get people saying this is cultural imperialism? Did you have to deal with politics at that level?
I appreciate the exact point that you just mentioned, and thank you for being so also very explicitly very direct about the point of knowledge. Cultural diplomacy has to be mutual. We cannot share a certain culture and then convey it to a culture that we would like to get acquainted with, without this being a mutual impact, a mutual that would create. Cultural diplomacy is like a sphere. It's like a medium of. It's almost like social media. It's almost like the wavelengths that we have flying around it. It should be a medium in which can facilitate and materialize mutual understanding and integration. But why? Why do we want to have mutual understanding and integration? It has to lead to capacity building, development, economical growth, business development, basic services. One of the points that we're missing, I think, the number of success stories and good news that are there, but they are not connected. We don't have a network. I mean, tonight we should create this network of peace builders around the globe, maybe through us and through whoever is watching. And through this is not an emotional approach. People function based upon self-interest, including terrorists. The point is how to overcome this and how to transcend it and how to secure, speaking of peace, how to secure a lifestyle, but before that, to secure the exposure and to help people to have a choice, a proper choice, to make a choice. You ask about Western music, that's exactly what I mentioned an hour ago. I would never have imagined to play my cello in Fallujah and Ramadi. The only thing people probably know about Fallujah is what had happened in 2004 and 2005, 2006, whatever, and then the amount of weapons that are in that little town that's actually probably smaller than the Bronx over here. But it took 37,000 troops, US troops, to try and control that city for 5 months, and ended up almost a verge of a civil war. So there was no there was no tension when classical music was there. But the reason was proactively working towards considering music in general to include different genres as a necessity, as a basic, important necessity for life. We were all probably at some point elitists. I don't know. I mean, at some point, an aristocrat, but then we realize it's about sharing socially, and it's about helping the community to overcome certain obstacles. They can be a traffic jam in the morning and you're rushing to your job over here and you can be stressed about it, or it can be going through 17 checkpoints like I have to do sometimes in Iraq. And then so the point is a certain lifestyle that I was trying to assure people that they can actually be exposed to, and they can prioritize, and they can consider music, refinement, civility, and cultivation as part of their day-to-day life. I went to the refugee camps, and when I performed over there, whether it was improvisations or Bach or my own pieces or whichever music I was playing, the impact on these little kids who had known nothing but guns and takbir and terror and so forth was almost the same as I would get from a concert in Europe or in the States. Meaning, the impact is there, and mankind can function in a certain way that is actually unified and shared around the globe through such means of communication and such tools, which music is one. So classical music, to some extent, was not necessarily objected, but it needs a certain level of intelligentsia and the intellectual background to understand, musically, what is it about. But Iraq, for example, known for being a very cultured society, very deeply rooted in history, because you woke somewhere and it's a building that is there for 4,000 years. And poetry is very important. And exposure is very important, and knowledge. People seek knowledge, despite the gruesome dictatorship that ruled the country for years. And it wasn't only Iraq, by the way. The dictatorships were around the whole Middle East, so this wasn't a new thing. So, so we had to do 17 different jobs to get one concert going, to include debates, talks, exchange of ideas. What is it that about music? And proudly I can say that it does work, whether it's in Fallujah or in Manhattan or in China. It does work. It does work. We have tangible results, and I assure you, Master Alan, that this is an approach that you should not reconsider. This is just the beginning for something that has tangible results. It's not an experiment somewhere whether music does work or not. Will it prevent tension? Yes. If it supports and boosts, again, development, business development, capacity building, the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, knowledge, exposure, de-radicalization, prevention of tension, and so many other things that can be achieved through sound.